A teenager is missing. A police investigation exposes the deaths of dozens of boys and young men. All are traced to a single killer. A photographer turns to rape and torture, meticulously documenting his crimes on film and audio tape. In a quiet suburb, 4 people are found dead. Police wonder about the kind of madman who could commit this crime. For serial killers, one death is just the beginning. Obsessed, they strike again and again, learning more with each crime, improving, perfecting. They're confident they'll never be stopped. But the mind hunters work tirelessly for their capture. It's just after 6 o'clock on January 23, 1978, in California, when Sacramento County Police arrive at the home of Terry and David Wallen. They are called there by a neighbor at David's frantic request. 22-year-old Terry Wallen has been brutally murdered. The house shows signs of an intense struggle between Wallen and her killer. She has been shot and her body slashed. A large knife wound runs the length of her torso. Some of her internal organs have been removed. Investigators are horrified by the viciousness of the crime. The scene becomes more gruesome when they find evidence that suggests the killer might have consumed Wallen's blood. Officers find a yogurt cup with bloody lip prints around the rim. Sacramento police don't know what to make of the scene, but they know who can help them. They call on a specialist, a man who's familiar with horrific and bizarre murder cases. His name is Russ Vorpagel. He is a special agent with the FBI. The brutality of the slaying makes Vorpagel fear that the murderer couldn't control himself and that Terry Wallen's death may be just the beginning of his rampage.
There's just no need to disembowel a victim. There's no need to reach inside and cut out body parts. There's no need to cut a 4-inch piece of major artery and take it along with you. I mean, hey, we knew we had a nut and we were worried and we knew that something's going to happen.
Vorpagel called a colleague at the FBI. Robert Ressler has tracked and caught some of the world's most dangerous killers. As a criminal profiler for the FBI, he stakes out the darkest corners of a killer's mind. In the 1970s, he was one of the first to use the term serial killer to describe those who murder again and again. Robert Ressler is a mind hunter. Ressler struggles to understand the killer's mind by studying the crime scene. Knowing how the killer thinks is essential to predicting his next move. When will he strike? Who will he target?
You have to have an emotional need to solve a crime. You have to want to know who the offender was. You have to know what that person is, what he's like, what he was like before, during, and after the crime.
But there is a danger in identifying too closely with those who destroy. Ressler heeds the words of German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote that whoever fights monsters should not become a monster himself, and that when one looks into an abyss, the unblinking abyss stares directly back. For Robert Ressler, Nietzsche's observation is motivation and warning.
Looking into the abyss to me means looking into the depths, the deep crevices, the dark crevices of man's human mind. And when it says the abyss looks back, to me that means I'm looking back at myself. I'm seeing my reflection. Because in every horrible killer, yourself is in there somewhere in part. Somewhere in your life you could have gone that same road.
In the 1970s, Ressler was among the original members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the first FBI program to systematically research a killer's motivations. Ressler interviewed some of America's most notorious murderers in prison to learn about their habits and attitudes. Today, Ressler is a private consultant who works all over the world to help solve serial murders. In January of 1978, Ressler applied his knowledge to help Sacramento County investigators devise a psychological profile of Terry Wallen's murderer. It was the first step in tracking the killer. Ressler began his profile by examining the crime scene details.
What you look for at a crime scene is the positioning of the body, the way the body was left by the killer. You look at the state of the body from the standpoint of being clothed or unclothed, and of course you're looking for available weaponry, or did the killer take a weapon to the scene, use it, and take it away. These are all things that you really start sizing up in your head.
After Terry Wallen was shot, the killer cut her body with knives taken from her own kitchen. Then he left them in plain sight at the scene, a detail that would prove instructive for Ressler. Because the greatest number of serial killers are male, at the time, Vorpagel and Ressler conclude their suspect is a man. They also assume he's white, like the majority of American serial killers. The brutality of the crime and the killer's apparent disregard for leaving evidence behind convince the pair their subject is mentally ill. That helps them pinpoint the killer's age. Ressler knows that mental illness usually begins in adolescence. It would take at least 8 years for the killer to grow sick enough to perform the acts of violence he inflicted on Terry Wallen. Assuming symptoms began at age 15, Ressler figures the killer would be in his mid to late 20s. Any older, and he would have already committed several gruesome homicides. Ressler goes further. He believes the killer to be schizophrenic, a mental illness characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and bizarre behavior.
Get out of here!
The heinous nature of the crime points to full-blown psychosis, a total loss of contact with reality. Because he drinks the blood of his victims, investigators call him the vampire killer. From his office in Virginia, Ressler works feverishly with Vorpagel in Sacramento to refine the killer's profile. What would he look like? They are convinced police should look for someone thin. Male schizophrenics generally eat poorly when they eat at all. And Russ Vorpagel believes the murderer will pay little attention to his appearance.
A guy that is suffering from a major mental illness is probably going to have a deterioration in his hygiene. Probably doesn't cut his hair, wears the same clothes for weeks at a time, doesn't brush his teeth, is scroungy looking.
Given his bizarre behavior, the killer would likely live alone. Vorpagel delivers a copy of the profile to the Sacramento police to circulate throughout the county. But no strong suspect emerges. the vampire killer remains at large. Will the profilers find him before he kills again?
Sir?
3 days after Terry Wallen's brutal murder in 1978, less than a mile away from her house, the vampire killer strikes again. Police find the bodies of Daniel Meredith, Evelyn Miroth, and her son Jason. Missing and presumed dead is Miroth's 22-month-old nephew, Michael Ferriera. These new deaths convince Ressler and Vorpagel that unless this murderer is found quickly, he will strike again. The mind hunters redouble their efforts. Using information gathered from this crime scene, they refine their original profile. Again, the vampire killer shot his victims. Again, he used knives taken from the victim's kitchen. Two knives are found in the room, and another was found outside. He doesn't seem to care that he's left the weapons behind. These details tell profilers that the killer is not planning his crimes. Although he brings a gun, he cuts the bodies with weapons he finds at the scene and then leaves them there.
We have a knife that was used to mutilate the bodies. It was taken from the kitchen, used on the victim, and then discarded at the crime scene. Seeing this for a second time definitely reinforced in my mind that we were dealing with a highly disorganized killer.
Organized and disorganized. Careful. These words describe a serial killer's behavior before, during, and after murder. Organized serial killers carefully plot their moves. They cover their trail so thoroughly that little or no evidence remains to tie them to their crimes. By contrast, disorganized serial killers act on impulse. Their behavior is random, making their next move difficult to predict. Investigators find bloodstains in the bathtub. Profilers believe the vampire killer may have bathed in a mixture of water and blood. The crimes are becoming more gruesome and the killer more deranged and more disorganized.
Now, we know darn well that your normal, everyday person is not going to fill a tub with water and bathe in the blood. So here we see personality. Here we see mental illness. We see mental deterioration.
From the evidence at the crime scene, Vorpagel and Ressler reconstruct the grisly sequence of events. And the terrifying portrait of a man they've never seen begins to emerge. The evidence reinforces the mind hunter's belief that the vampire killer's appearance will continue to deteriorate. He likely won't have changed his clothes. Unless he is single and living alone, the killer can't possibly escape notice. Their subject is a thin, disheveled loner, not more than 30 years old. Investigators are puzzled when murder victim Daniel Meredith's stolen red station wagon turns up a short distance away. Because it was found nearby, Ressler determines the vampire killer must have walked to the crime scene and then fled on foot after abandoning the car.
The killer would be residing within a very close distance to that abandoned car. I said approximately 1/4 mile.
The day after the Miroth murders, police receive an unrelated report that a dog has been shot and mutilated within blocks of the crime scene. For the mind hunters, it's the break they've been looking for. They know that as children, serial killers often mutilate or kill animals.
And he would go out and kill these pets, shooting them with the same gun he shot Wallen and Miroth and Meredith. Same gun, he'd shoot these pets. And then he'd gut them and drink their blood.
As more animals are found dead, the circle closes. The mind hunters are convinced that the vampire killer lives near the slaughtered animals and his human victims. He won't have traveled far. Police circulate the revised profile throughout the city in hopes that someone may have seen a disheveled or strange-acting man. Officers concentrate on a quarter-mile radius of the murders. As a woman in her late 20s is leaving a Sacramento shopping center, a strange man approaches her. Hearing of the vampire killer murders, the woman contacts police. The man she eluded at the shopping center, she tells officers, is a former high school classmate, Richard Trenton Chase. She was shocked by his appearance. He had bloodstains on his sweatshirt. His eyes seemed sunk into their sockets. A yellowed crust was around his mouth. According to the woman's description, Chase fits the profile of the vampire killer. Armed with a search warrant, officers enter Chase's home. They're unprepared for what they find. Nazi paraphernalia dominates the small apartment. The place is littered with pamphlets about alien conspiracies. The chaos in the living room fits the profile of someone with an equally chaotic mind. In the kitchen, police find appliances spattered with blood, as well as newspaper articles about the murder of Terry Wallen. Several dishes in the refrigerator contain human tissue. In a kitchen drawer are knives taken from Wallen's home. Investigators also find a toolbox and blood-stained rubber boots. Chase is arrested and charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, including the killing of Evelyn Miroth's nephew, 22-month-old Michael Ferriera, whose remains are found not far from Chase's apartment. The jury deliberates only a few hours before pronouncing Chase guilty on all counts. The sentence? Death in the electric chair. In 1979, Robert Ressler decided to talk to Chase in prison.
The reason I interviewed him, very frankly, was to validate, to do an update and validate the profiling work that I had done, to talk to him directly after working on the case, after seeing the crime scenes, after reading the police reports, and of course the court records. It's a way you really fine-tune your profiling.
Chase tells Ressler that he had killed only to preserve his own life. He needed blood, Chase says, to survive what he called soap dish poisoning. Chase believed that a gooey residue under his soap dish proved he was dying. He claimed his blood was drying out and corroding his body. His killings, Chase contended, were made in self-defense.
When he got down to the motivation, he said that the blood in his veins, the blood throughout his entire body, was turning to powder or dust, and that it was moving very slowly through his body, causing him to slow down, causing him to be fatigued and become very ill. And he felt this was being done, of course, he said, by the influence of the unidentified flying objects and the aliens. And he said that the only way he could counter this was to get a fresh supply of human blood.
What drives a man like Chase to murder? One FBI study of 36 serial killers revealed that although most began life in two-parent homes, by age 2, almost half the boys' fathers had abandoned their families. Nearly half of the surveyed offenders reported cold or uncaring relationships with their mothers. 26 reported such relationships with their fathers. Nearly 70% of the families had histories of alcohol abuse. 1/3 had histories of drug abuse. Almost all reported some form of childhood psychological, physical, or sexual abuse. As children, many serial killers tortured animals. The majority did not graduate from high school. While the men had the required intelligence to perform skilled jobs, most had poor work histories. Only 20%, or 6 offenders, had ever managed to hold on to steady work. Yet, to all appearances, serial killers seem normal, like your neighbor or your friend.
Most of these people are like everyday people. They oftentimes are intelligent, they're attractive, they're good conversationalists. IQ's usually up about, at least high normal or beyond, and they're very deceptive.
Ressler was opposed to the death sentence for Chase. Chase, he argued, was mentally ill and should have been locked up for life in a prison hospital. Prison psychiatrists eventually agreed. Chase's sentence was commuted to life in the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. But Chase killed himself in his prison cell just after Christmas, 1980. He had stockpiled his antidepressant pills and then taken them all at once. Richard Trenton Chase's brief and chaotic reign of terror had come to an end. In contrast, one of America's most cunning serial killers was also one of the most organized. Highly intelligent and a talented photographer, this murderer specialized in kidnapping, rape, and torture. Police called him the unidentified subject, or unsub. He was a master of planning. He used film and audio tape to record his crimes. In a rented storage shed, he stockpiled pictures of his victims and recordings of their anguished cries. He was so meticulous that he would leave virtually no evidence of his atrocities, except for the photographs he took himself. Unsub customized his cars to resemble unmarked police cars. He added heavy-duty suspensions and strong restraints so that once inside, his victims had virtually no chance of escape. For 5 years, he traveled from state to state, never staying in one place too long. He was self-reliant, financing his crimes of kidnapping, rape, and torture with yet another crime. He was a skilled counterfeiter. He was confident that he would never be caught. In Manassas, Virginia, a team of former FBI agents pursue some of the world's most dangerous criminals. They call themselves the Academy Group. Between them, they have amassed years of experience investigating serial killings. Robert Hazelwood and Peter Smerick are experts in psychological profiling of criminals.
If you in life are an impulsive person, you act without thinking, well then that crime scene may be very, very sloppy and be a reflection of your impulsive acts. On the other hand, if in life you're a cold, calculating individual, you don't take any unnecessary risks, well, that type of behavior can also be demonstrated at a crime scene.
Even with crime scene evidence, categorizing serial killers is difficult. Some serial killers demonstrate a mixture of disorganized and organized habits.
All too often, If an investigator starts looking at a crime scene and tries to put the offender into one of these nice, neat little categories, he's going to be disappointed when the person he arrests doesn't fit these categories in all areas.
In the seaside resort of Ocean City, Maryland, a young woman has just finished her shift at a convenience store. It is Memorial Day weekend, 1979. She is approached by a man who identifies himself as a police officer. He shows her his identification and is driving an unmarked police car. He tells the woman she is a suspect in a series of robberies, and he insists that she accompany him to police headquarters for questioning. He handcuffs her and pushes her into the car. It's the beginning of the longest and most terrifying experience of the woman's life. The man is no police officer. He is unsubbed. And she's his latest victim. He takes her to a deserted building where he repeatedly rapes and tortures her. He photographs and tape records the ordeal.
I think one of the buzzwords today that we use is power and control. And whether you're dealing with a rapist, whether you're dealing with a serial killer, I think it still comes down to those two basic elements: power and control over the life of another individual.
Eventually, he will push the dazed woman back into his car and take her for one last ride.
He stops the automobile, opens up the passenger door, and rolls the woman out into a ditch. But he did not kill her. He allowed this victim to live. And as a result, within a number of hours when daylight came, she was found, she was rescued, and now became a full-fledged FBI investigation for kidnapping.
The FBI set up a massive manhunt for Unsub. The Ocean City woman was the latest in a long list of his victims. Some were tortured, others murdered. But many years passed before there was a break in the case. At the same time the FBI searched for Unsub, the Secret Service was on the trail of an elusive counterfeiter, a man who routinely passed fake $20 bills to unsuspecting store clerks at malls and shops in the Midwest and on the East Coast.
The one thing about any law enforcement agency, no matter how good we are, you need an element of luck, and you need the cooperation of an alert citizenry. In this instance, an alert clerk recognized a composite sketch as a customer who was currently in the store. She notified mall security notified local authorities, and within a short period of time, the suspect was apprehended.
The man police arrest is James Mitchell DeBartoleben. The Secret Service soon discovers that DeBartoleben is not just a counterfeiter. Secret Service agents search a storage unit rented by DeBartoleben. Inside are sheaves of the fake currency he's been passing. But to their shock, agents also discover a grotesque treasure trove of pictures and audio tape. The 1983 discovery unmasks the focus of the FBI investigation. Robert Hazelwood, then an FBI special agent who had written a criminal profile of Unsub, reviewed the materials seized from DeBartoleben's storage unit. Agents find thousands of photographs of DeBartoleben's victims. Among them are are photos and audio tape of the woman abducted in Ocean City in 1979. Some of the photos date back to the early 1960s. They find the tools of a killer's trade. Victim's clothing, 10 guns, phony police identification, journals, blood-stained lingerie, and jewelry. 7 license plates allowed DeBartoleben to roam with little fear of his car being traced. The FBI also found handwritten notes. They contained codes that referred to past and future crimes. Although they have uncovered DeBartoleben's cache of damning images and sounds, agents have a problem. The killer's face remains literally out of the frame of the pictures he's taken with the victims. Investigators will have to prove DeBartoleben is the man in the photographs if they are to tie him conclusively to the rapes and deaths. During his FBI career, Peter Smerek was a forensic photography expert. The Secret Service sent him a number of DeBartoleben's photos to analyze. Several show a naked torso and uncovered arms. Smerek focuses his attention on the arms. They have a distinctive pattern of small moles and freckles. Smerek asks the Secret Service to temporarily remove DeBartoleben from his prison cell in order to photograph him in the same position as the person in the confiscated photos. The gambit pays off. When Smerek compares the photographs taken by the Secret Service to the ones found in the storage unit, he finds the patterns of freckles match. It's the proof agents desperately seek.
In all the years that I've worked as a criminal profiler, I can't think of another case where the offender was such an excellent photographer that unknowingly he took his own crime scene photographs, which ended up putting him in prison.
In 1984, DeBartoleben was tried and convicted. Today, he is in a federal penitentiary in Texas, sentenced to multiple life terms.
DeBartoleben was one of the most dangerous criminals that ever walked the face of the earth, in my opinion. He was able to commit a number of crimes over a number of years in a variety of states and never have those crimes linked to him. That made him extremely dangerous. I think he's involved in a lot more crimes than we're aware of, yes.
By controlling every variable, weapons, location, and victim, the organized serial killer can slip through any dragnet, getting away with murder for years as he hides in plain sight. Such was the case of John Wayne Gacy, a prominent Chicago area businessman. Well-liked and respected, Gacy camouflaged a terrible secret. In 1978, in Des Plaines, Illinois, 15-year-old Robert Piest was reported missing. Having learned that Gacy was preparing a remodeling bid for a drugstore where Piest worked, Chief Detective Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department goes to Gacy's home. Gacy denies knowing Piest. But investigators are suspicious. A background check reveals Gacy was once convicted of the sexual abuse of a teenage boy. Kozenzak places Gacy under surveillance. Initially cooperative with the police, Gacy becomes increasingly surly as Kozenzak's investigation continues.
He had a real mean look in his eyes. You could feel that there was hatred there. And that he really didn't care what we were investigating and was more concerned about trying to stay out of the way.
Gacy threatens a lawsuit if police continue their surveillance. Officers persist, suspecting that Gacy has much to hide. But even they are not prepared for what they'll find. For several weeks in 1978, Des Plaines police didn't let John Wayne Gacy out of their sight. Finally, it came time to search his house. The search uncovers a photo receipt that belonged to Robert Piest, linking Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A more thorough search would reveal even more. Chief Detective Kozenzak was the first to enter Gacy's home.
I was one of the first people that arrived at the house and went in through the back door, walked in. The whole place was just dark and kind of eerie. All the window blinds had been closed. And there was some sense of, I don't know, it was kind of ominous actually, because we were starting to believe that there could be people buried underneath Gacy's house based on the information we had gathered.
Police interviewed Gacy's ex-wife, friends, and former employees. Stories came out that Gacy propositioned his workers for sexual favors, that some had disappeared, and that his house had a strange odor. One of his workers suggests they checked the crawl space. After rigorous questioning, Gacy admits to detectives that 4 years earlier, in 1974, he killed one of his homosexual partners. Gacy claims the murder was in self-defense. He hid the man's body beneath the floor. Then, Gacy shocks investigators. He confesses that he murdered almost 36 young men and boys, also hiding many of their bodies under the floor. The confessions trigger an intense search for the missing men. Detectives examine the crawl space in the hope of finding Gacy's victims. They uncover 3 decomposing bodies and parts of other bodies. But the police don't stop with the crawl space. Knowing more bodies must be stashed under the house, they cut away the floor to find them. Eventually, they would find bodies buried under the dining room and garage floor. Under the house is a virtual killing field of buried bones and jumbled skeletons. Police arrest Gacy for the murder of Robert Piest, though the bodies they uncovered were dead too long to be the missing boy.
Gacy, he figured that the best way not to get caught for his crimes was to keep control of his victims after death. But when you're a psychopath, a sexual psychopath, he figured nobody would ever find those bodies down there because he was too smart, smarter than police, smarter than everybody.
By stashing his victims in his own home, Gacy maintained total control over them, even in death, and could remain confident that no one would ever find them without his knowledge. Such careful attention to detail, from planning to death, is the mark of a highly organized killer.
Everything about the case, especially when viewing the home inside, would indicate that Gacy was highly methodical, very well planned, and that he had thought these crimes out in great detail prior to embarking upon them.
Gacy also dumped his victims in the Des Plaines River. Police recovered 6 more bodies there. One of them was Robert Piest. When it was over, police identified the remains of 33 people.
Bob was very interested in this process because the FBI was formulating within their behavioral science unit kind of an in-depth study of people who commit a series of killings and wanting to know more about them, wanting to understand them, and this was a classic case.
The goal of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit is to map the mind of the serial killer.
So many people believe that it's the sexual act itself that he's performing with the victim that is of primary importance to him. In reality, it's the entire game that's important to them. The selection process, the surveillance, knowing that I have selected you to become my victim and you don't know it. And then all of the planning that goes into the stages of actually conducting the abduction. And so they are rehearsing this and living this maybe for weeks or months before the actual abduction occurs. And to a certain extent, the sexual activity afterwards may almost be an aftermath.
That's gotta hurt.
With each killing, Gacy refined his methods, learned from his mistakes, and improved on his successes. He carefully lured his victims into a well-designed trap, distracting them with weightlifting, plying them with alcohol, and showing pornographic movies.
Bring it down to your chest, all the way down. Okay, can you bring it up? You can lift it up.
He eventually grew so confident that he brazenly targeted a boy from his own neighborhood. Many victims came to Gacy's home hoping to get a job with his contracting firm. He'd meet with them in his garage.
But it feels so good.
The soundproof garage was designed by Gacy and constructed by his company.
Excellent. Good job, you okay? Yeah, you probably feel it right here, don't you?
A motorized door was the only way in or out.
Here's something I haven't shown you.
If his victim didn't object, Gacy would demonstrate a magic trick using trick handcuffs.
Like this. Sound real good, right? Okay. Ready?
After showing how the handcuffs work, Gacy would persuade his victim to try them.
Ready? All right. Now, you did it the easy way, the hard way.
Then he would challenge him to attempt the trick behind his back. If the victim agreed, the trap was sprung. Gacy would switch the trick handcuffs for real ones.
On. This one like this. There you go. Okay. Now, twist.
Once immobilized, the victim was at Gacy's mercy.
Hey, come on, man.
1, 2, 3. Try to twist it.
Only Gacy knows exactly what happened
You have to
next.
relax. Come on, Bobby, relax. Okay.
Like serial rapist and killer James Mitchell DeBartoleben, Gacy thought he had completely covered his tracks. But mementos found during the search of Gacy's home provided key evidence, though police didn't know it at the time. Detectives discovered driver's licenses, belt buckles, rings, and other personal effects. Ressler alerted investigators to the importance of these objects.
We had actually found these items not fully realizing what we had found till after Bob came in and started pointing out to us that to you a belt buckle is not important, but to the person who committed the crime, it's very important. It's a visual process to help relive the crime at any given time that he wants to do so.
The souvenirs are a reminder of his past murders and an inspiration to kill again.
To Gacy, this is some sort of a symbol of his success, a reminder. It enhances his fantasy and carries him on to the next victim. Trophies, I call them, for the serial killer, where they kind of enhances their fantasy to have these objects around.
The most disturbing object found in Gacy's house was a map indicating job sites around the United States where he had worked as a contractor. Ressler believes it's likely that Gacy wouldn't have confined his killings to Chicago.
And it only seemed logical that if Gacy's traveling doing this in Chicago, he's doing it elsewhere as well. That's why I firmly believe that John Gacy killed more than the 33 he was convicted of. I think probably maybe twice that number.
Forensic teams dismantled Gacy's house. In all, they recovered 27 bodies there. How many more Gacy killed, police would never know. For 10 years, starting in 1979, Ressler interviewed Gacy in prison. Ressler was surprised to learn that he had grown up 4 blocks from the killer in suburban Chicago. Gacy even remembered delivering groceries to the Ressler family, recalling in detail the distinctive flower pots that Ressler's mother used. Gacy also had darker recollections. He described for Ressler a turbulent relationship with his father. Ressler wasn't surprised. Nearly all the serial killers he knows of tell similar stories.
And it's all documented. I ran away from home, as you know, when I was 19 years old because I couldn't get along with my father. I mean, he was just overbearing. I was dumb and stupid, never would amount to anything, and so I just took off and said, to hell with it. I was gone for 3 months. Well, it's more likely.
From prison, Gacy made a painting and sent it to Ressler.
What is amazing is now...
It depicted Gacy dressed in a clown costume.
When I got into clown makeup, I regressed into childhood. It was fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool. You know how people, if you're a businessman, you've got to keep a certain rapport and stuff like that, and everybody looks for you for an image. But as a clown with the makeup on, you could be slapstick and funny and have a good time. That's why I always enjoyed clowning.
In Gacy's painting, he stands in a grove of evergreen trees, surrounded by balloons. The inscription on the back reads, "You cannot hope to enjoy the harvest without first laboring in the fields." Gacy refused to explain the painting's meaning to Ressler or to anyone else. Ressler believes the painting hints at many more murders Gacy committed.
He said, you can get away with a lot of things when you're behaving as a clown because people see you as something funny, they see you as something as amusing, they don't know what's beneath the grease paint, they don't know what's beneath the cloth. He said clowns can get away with murder.
John Wayne Gacy died by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Since the early years of criminal profiling in the 1970s, other serial murderers have been identified and caught. Such names as Son of Sam, Ted Bundy, and Jeffrey Dahmer have become known to mind hunters and to a public alternately fascinated and repelled by their crimes.
Serial killers are driven by control, by dominance, by discipline, by authority. They have very warped concepts of interaction with another human being. They don't look at another human being as a human being, they look at them as an object.
Robert Ressler believes that serial killing, while not limited to the United States, has intensified in this country since the end of World War II. Part of the reason has to do with a culture that glamorizes and encourages violence.
Culture produces violent crime. I would say 75% of the world's serial killers are American products. Yeah, it sounds very strange, but it's one of our, it's like America, it's like a baseball, apple pie mom and serial homicide. It's unfortunate, and it's certainly tragic in a sense, but it's one thing in the world of criminology. The United States is absolutely broken all records.
Profilers must take care that the poisonous thoughts of those they track don't pollute their own. For one who stares into the abyss, there is a danger of falling in. Ressler says that mind hunters must work their way back from the brink every day of their lives.
I've maintained a balance, I think, consciously, by isolating myself from the horror of what I see. I go to work at 8, I quit at 5, I go back to a normal life, I have a drink, I watch the news, I cut the grass. I've kept a perspective. I've kept in tune with the mainstream and the normal people of society.
For Ressler, profiling is less about drama than about analysis. Observe, think, conclude, and realize there are no easy or quick answers.
And the movie concepts is that the profiler will solve the case, everybody can fold up their tents and go home. Profiling is one tool in the overall toolbox of the investigator. It gives him one more dimension, one more piece of that puzzle. And when you put it all together, sometimes it's very effective.
Profilers explore the mind's darkest regions, dragging what's hidden into the light of day. Only then can it be examined and learned from.
The value of profiling, as in this case of Richard Chase, is to give the police some concept, some psychological portrait or an image of the logical type of subject that they're looking for, to give them a clear picture, because otherwise it's just an empty room.
These human monsters feel they can never be caught, that they are invulnerable. Yet, with each new victim, each drop of blood, each fiber or DNA strand left at the scene of a crime, the mind hunters probe deeper into the killer's mind. Perhaps the day will come when profilers won't be needed. But for now, the mind hunters will have to continue looking into the abyss. In Los Angeles, forensics experts try to make sense of a photo shoot that crossed the line from daring to deadly. In the Pacific Northwest, law enforcement hunts a brutal predator whose lust for violence is reaching fever pitch. As detectives follow the footsteps of a killer, a double homicide investigation spurs an international manhunt. The law has no jurisdiction in the human mind, where a killer's twisted motives may forever defy police. But actions cannot defy science. Through forensics, detectives can track even the most deranged criminals and put an end to their lethal obsessions. In Los Angeles, where image is everything, a pretty face and sexy body can launch a woman into the spotlight. But not everyone makes it that far. In November 1995, a model went to a photo shoot and vanished. Days went by without a word. Worried friends and parents had no clue to her whereabouts. Then, she caught the eye of a passing stranger. One afternoon, a trash collector working along the Angeles Crest Highway found a daydream in the litter.
The 27-year-old model.
Several days later, he saw the woman's face again.
Disappeared 7 days ago.
She was Linda Sobek, a model from Hermosa Beach who had been missing for 5 days. He contacted the police about his odd discovery.
Yeah, hi, this is Frank Artino. Yeah, I'm calling about that girl that you have on TV.
A former LA Raider cheerleader, 27-year-old Sobek was riding a wave of success. Her schedule was packed with shoots for magazine covers and calendar spreads. She had just landed a part on a popular sitcom. The day she disappeared, Linda told her mother that she would be at a remote photo shoot with a photographer named Chuck. Her mother didn't know who Chuck was or where they were going. Linda promised to call her after the shoot. No call ever came. The trash collector showed police where he dumped the roadside trash.
Yeah, I threw him in here with one of these bags, but this bag right here.
This bag?
There, they found more photographs, pages ripped from Sobek's appointment book, and a makeup bag. They also found a clue they hoped would lead them to the model. The receipt was for the loan of a sport utility vehicle, a prototype that hadn't been released yet. It was signed by Charles Rathbun and dated November 16th, the same day Sobek disappeared. It seemed the mysterious Chuck had been identified. Rathbun, police learned, was a respected photographer who specialized in pictures of new cars. He was considered one of the best in his field. Rathbun said he didn't know how his receipt got mixed in with Linda Sobek's belongings, but admitted that he was probably the last person to have seen her. On the morning of her disappearance, he said, Sobek asked him to meet her at a restaurant parking lot. She was looking for work. He wasn't interested. Detective Mike Robinson of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department took Rathbun's statement.
He said that he met with her briefly in the Denny's parking lot, looked at her portfolio, and told her that he had a very tight schedule and pushed her out of the car and left her there at noon on the day she disappeared. He said his last observation of her was standing in the parking lot unlocking her white Datsun.
Sobek's car was still in the parking lot, but there the trail grew cold. Rathbun, the last to have seen her, was the only lead to the missing model. Police asked him to come to the station for a more complete interview. He didn't keep his appointment.
He called later that day and said that he had car problems and then never showed up and never called back.
But police learned that Rathbun had contacted a friend in law enforcement. She had received a rambling fax in which he confessed to accidentally killing Sobek. He also threatened to kill himself. Police rushed to his house. They found him drunk and incoherent. He was taken into custody. In jail, Rathbun gave police a second account of what happened. He admitted that he'd lied when he said he hadn't hired Linda Sobek. He recounted a tragic accident at a dry lake bed in the Mojave Desert. Rathbun wanted to photograph Linda taking the rugged prototype through its paces. He got behind the wheel to show her how to spin it. He claimed he had lost control of the 2.5-ton vehicle, and the rear end slammed into Sobek, killing her. Panicked, Rathbun dug a grave with his hands and abandoned the body. He said he was so traumatized, he couldn't remember where he'd buried her. Police didn't believe this sudden change of story. But with nothing more to go on, they couldn't refute his account. Flimsier alibis have held up in court. Investigators were not about to let that happen. The case entered its next phase, to find the flaws in Rathbun's story. Police got hold of the car. Unfortunately, it had been detailed at least twice since Rathbun borrowed it. Investigators hoped that some evidence survived the thorough cleaning. The first task was to search for signs of impact. L.A. County criminalist Heidi Robbins didn't find any.
The initial examination revealed no such evidence on the exterior of the car. Being that it was a prototype, it was a brand new vehicle right off the line, so it was very clean, which is really not what we're used to looking at as forensic scientists or criminalists. The vehicle it didn't have a scratch on it. There wasn't a dent to be seen.
Perhaps the victim had been run over, not struck. The vehicle was placed on a lift. Again, the car was clean.
We didn't see any type of blood or tissue or fiber evidence at all associated with the exterior or undercarriage of that vehicle.
The next step was to examine the vehicle's interior. Although the leather seating looked pristine, it was not. Blood residue was found in the crevice between the seat cushions and had stained the stitching. Tests showed that it matched Sobek's blood type. 4 long blonde hairs were collected and shown to have belonged to her. Robbins noticed that one of the doors had a deep dent in it. It seemed that a struggle may have occurred inside. The marks inside the car suggested a tale far different from Rathbun's, but the whole story couldn't be told without Sobek's body, and Rathbun had conveniently forgotten where it was. In custody, he tried to commit suicide, asserting that it was all a mistake. He wrote in his own blood that he never meant to hurt anyone. The act could be read as either despair or cunning calculation. In an apparent attempt to prove his sincerity, 8 days after Linda Sobek had disappeared, Rathbun recalled where he had buried her. He directed the search party to a steep ravine, 6,000 feet up, 40 miles from the site of the photo shoot. Buried more than a week, the remains would probably yield few clues about the factors that led to her death.
It's always been my contention that Rathbun decided to contribute to our efforts on the day that he did because he felt that the body would be so decomposed that we wouldn't be able to determine those factors.
For Detective Robinson, Rathbun's confession and suicide attempt didn't ring true. To him, the photographer was artfully controlling the investigation, meting out information too little, too late. His sudden recollection of the burial site was the latest example. Supervised by a forensic anthropologist, Robin's team carefully removed the body. Each rock from the top of the grave was numbered and cataloged. Inch by inch, soil was lifted from the grave, then sifted and analyzed. After 8 hours, investigators had their most crucial piece of evidence. 2 feet down, they found Sobek. Much to their surprise, the elements had spared her.
There was very little degradation, and I think due to the coldness and that altitude and the ravine that she was buried in had such minimal amount of sun exposure, she essentially was refrigerated for those 9 days.
Investigators surveyed the body. Had the victim been struck by a car, she would have had knee-level injuries. Her legs showed no broken bones or abrasions, but they did bear severe ligature marks. It appeared she'd been bound around the ankles. The condition of her clothes also suggested something more than a luckless accident and hasty burial.
Most women are probably comfortable wearing a zip top somewhere maybe in the center of their chest. And Linda's clothing was zipped all the way up to the base of her neck. I thought that's a very unnatural position, and to me, when you see clothing that has a bit of an unnatural position, it indicates the possibility that there may have been some redress or some alteration of the clothing.
The unnatural position of her clothes suggested that Rathbun had dressed her, possibly after her death. And apparently, by trying to wipe away evidence, Rathbun inadvertently created a second clue that revealed he wasn't telling the full story.
She was a model. She wore makeup. She was on a photo shoot. And when she was recovered from that grave, there was a complete absence of any makeup or any residues thereof that we could detect in the crime scene. And that concerned me also.
The condition of her clothing, makeup, and the marks around her ankles suggested that the victim wasn't just standing around before she died. Something else was going on, and it pointed to murder. Linda Sobek was photographed for the last time on the autopsy table. From marks on her body, the medical examiner could tell that she had been smothered. Hemorrhaging in the eyes showed the breath was literally squeezed out of her, and she hadn't gone without a struggle. Her wrist was sprained. She had been tied up. The physical evidence shattered Rathbun's story of a car accident. As the case went to trial, a first-degree murder charge seemed inevitable, but Rathbun wasn't finished. In a bid for a manslaughter conviction, he offered another account of what happened. His new version explained away all of the evidence. In what was now Rathbun's third rendition, he claimed that Sobek began to undress and strike erotic poses. He said she was a tease. She became upset when he took pictures of her. He set the camera aside and they started kissing, but she wouldn't let it go further. After things cooled down and she got dressed, Rathbun showed her how to make the car spin. But he was too reckless. He thought he hit and killed her, but she'd only stumbled, trying to get clear. She cut her face when she fell. Rathbun told authorities he put her in the car to take her to the hospital. She became hysterical, fighting with him and threatening a lawsuit. He tried to restrain her with a bear hug, but she only grew more agitated and more violent. As a last resort, he sat on her. She finally grew quiet. Then he realized she wasn't breathing. He pulled her out of the car to try to revive her, but she was dead. To explain the ligature marks, Rathbun said he then bound the model's ankles to better maneuver the unwieldy body back into the vehicle. He then buried her. It was a colorful story, but once again, it felt too contrived.
I felt that in trying to answer every piece of evidence that the prosecution had presented, he sort of built a patchwork quilt that wasn't real square at the edges. It just didn't have the right form to it.
If Rathbun could sell this fabrication to the jury, he'd likely get off with manslaughter. To prove his case, Rathbun provided the court with 5 rolls of film from the photo shoot. He explained that he had left them in the desert after the victim was killed. He had his brother retrieve them for him. 4 of the rolls showed Sobek modeling, but the 5th roll was almost unrecognizable. Rathbun explained that it contained the intimate photos of Linda Sobek that proved she was teasing him. But in the heat of the moment, he'd grabbed a roll he'd already shot. Not realizing, he took pictures of Linda Sobek over pictures of the Lexus interior. The harsh desert climate also had apparently affected the rolls, ruining the emulsion. Rathbun presented 13 distorted images of a woman in pornographic poses, double exposed over a car interior. And along with them, he served up a modified version of what happened. This version better explained the condition of the victim's clothes and makeup.
At this point in time, the facts of the story changed. We had another version of the truth come out at this point. And it was suggested that her death actually resulted not from a vehicle this time, but from this consensual sexual activity that had gotten out of hand, a little too rough, and accidentally resulted in her death. These photographs were introduced to prove this latest version of the truth.
Investigators set out to prove the photos were fakes. Detective Robinson felt the pictures were too damaged to be conclusive. He needed to determine if the Lexus and the woman in these photos were really who Rathbun said they were. He learned that several weeks before borrowing the Lexus, Rathbun had photographed a 1998 Oldsmobile prototype. The detective requested Rathbun's pictures of that car's interior from the manufacturer. Heidi Robbins brought the double-exposed images and the Oldsmobile interiors to the National Law Enforcement and Corrections Technology Center in El Segundo, California, for comparison. The agency provides sophisticated forensic imaging technology for law enforcement. The images were scanned into a high-speed computer and enhanced with graphics software. Before they could make sense, engineer Bill Repetto digitally enhanced their contrast, shadow detail, and color.
The films are in really bad shape. In fact, a lot of the emulsion is missing. So the detectives really didn't have a full shot of the entire dashboard. Using our equipment, we were able to alter the contrast, do some sharpening, look for features that were hard to do in the conventional photographic process, but we can do it in real time on a computer. So I guess you're interested in finding out, is that a body part or is that part of the dashboard?
Once the pictures were sharpened, Repetto sized and overlaid the Oldsmobile dashboard atop the damaged negative. His goal was to see if the car in the photos was really the Lexus that Sobek died in, or if it was the Oldsmobile.
That you can match up things like the speedometer dial, the radius of the steering wheel. Unfortunately, we can't see this pattern, the logo on the steering wheel, but it matches up pretty good. I mean, you work with this just a few minutes and it's pretty darn obvious this is not a Lexus, this is an Oldsmobile.
Repetto next had to eliminate Linda Sobek as the faceless model. He compared the dress Sobek wore at the photo shoot to a portion of lace shown in the double-exposed images. Because lace patterns repeat, it only takes a fragment of the material to point out a mismatch.
Now in this image, you can see that there's a definite pattern here. There's a boot-shaped mark, a vertical feature, and it bends over to the left, and that's repeated up here.
The lace patterns were inconsistent. So were comparisons between Sobek's anatomy and the model in the photos. Rathbun's latest account was disproven.
The defense, on their fourth and final version of the truth, when the defendant took the stand, had to go up and explain all the physical evidence findings and the circumstances surrounding the death. And in his testimony, he did initially state that this was the Lexus and that this was in fact Linda Sobek. And it was very powerful rebuttal testimony when the jury could see for themselves that not only was this not the Lexus, but this clearly was not Linda Sobek.
Once again, the facts contradicted Rathbun's story. The jury didn't buy any of Rathbun's tales. Charles Rathbun was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Almost from the start, the photographer was the focal point of the Sobek case. But when murder is more random, investigators must take a wider view. In Beaverton, Oregon, on the morning after Valentine's Day, 1981, police were called to a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. There, they found the body of 18-year-old Julianne Reitz. She'd been shot in the back of the head with 2 .38 caliber bullets, apparently while running for her life. The medical examiner determined that she died between 3 and 4 a.m. As investigators processed the crime scene, Detective Dave Bishop gathered the first important clue.
The telltale signs were that the victim knew whoever killed her. The door was unlocked, the stereo was on, there was a couple wine glasses in the sink.
Police searched the townhouse for any traces the killer may have left behind. No fingerprints were lifted, but technicians did recover hair and fiber samples. Upstairs, they found signs of a struggle.
The bed was just totally tore apart, sheets everywhere, and it was just, it was obvious that, there was a war up there.
Stains on the sheets showed that a man with type B blood had had sexual relations with the victim. Within a week of the murder, detectives questioned over 150 of the victim's friends and acquaintances. Several mentioned an older man who had recently resurfaced from her past. He worked at a local club and dated her once or twice the year before. Reitz thought he was a little overbearing and decided they should just be friends. His name was Randall Woodfield. Randy had been an All-American athlete and was drafted by the Green Bay Packers for a brief stint in the NFL. He was an affable, fun-loving guy, but he was no Boy Scout. Police learned that he was on probation, having served 3 years for robbing joggers in Portland. Police arranged an interview with him. He vaguely remembered the victim, but said he hadn't seen her for months. Investigators found him candid and agreeable.
You know, if you didn't know him, he would be the guy next door. I mean, he was, and pleasant to talk to. Not, used very little profanity, soft-spoken.
Woodfield was forthcoming about his past, but suspicions were raised when he refused to submit hair samples or take a polygraph test. 7 grueling hours of interrogation produced little information, but managed to wear him down. He finally agreed to let police search his apartment.
I told the detectives the first thing that that when we went into the house to grab was the sheets off his bed, and because that was going to give us the hair and blood.
Investigators got the hair sample they wanted from Woodfield's sheets. They also found a .32 caliber bullet and a roll of athletic tape in his gym bag. Ordinarily, these items meant nothing. Now, police weren't so sure. Athletic tape was a crucial clue in a rash of unsolved rapes and murders that had been occurring along Interstate 5 for more than 2 months. Detectives wondered if they were onto something bigger than an isolated homicide. Suspicions intensified when investigators checked Woodfield's phone bill to see if he'd called Julie Reitz.
He was living with a young lady at that time, actually, who owned the house, and he was renting a portion of the house. I said, do you know whether or not he's made any phone calls to Beaverton? And her response was, probably, because I just got the phone bill today and it was over $200 and some. So he's called everybody.
He obtained a copy of Woodfield's phone bill from his housemate. When he was on the road, Woodfield liked to stay in touch with former girlfriends, charging calls to his housemate's phone. Bishop searched the bill for Reitz's number. He didn't find it, but the other numbers on the bill formed a chilling pattern.
But all of a sudden, as I'm going through this, it became very obvious that what I'm seeing is scary. It's the map of I-5.
Beginning in December 1980, a predator hunted along Interstate 5 over 3 states, robbing roadside establishments, sodomizing and killing the young women who worked there. A task force had been set up to track the killer's movements, to gather the paltry clues. He was rigorously consistent, preying on strangers, leaving no prints.
Dark-haired, dark-eyed, described as handsome.
He often wore false beards and hoods.
About 6'2".
On January 18, 1981, 1 month before Reitz was killed, police and rescue were called to an office building in Salem, Oregon, several miles down I-5 from where Julie Reitz was killed.
What do you got?
Lisa Garcia and Sherry Hull had been cleaning an office when an intruder slipped in. The women were sexually assaulted. Both were shot in the back of the head. Astonishingly, Garcia never lost consciousness. Though groggy and confused, she was able to dial 911. A twist of fate had kept 2 bullets from entering Garcia's brain. Hull was not so fortunate. She died at the hospital. Detectives analyzed the office crime scene. They collected hair and fiber samples and 2 .32 caliber slugs. The evidence and the method of attack matched the profile of a killer who'd been creating a one-man crime wave. Oregon detectives believed they may have stumbled onto the trail of the serial killer who prowled Interstate 5. The I-5 killer's victims were always attractive young women with long hair. He would often bind their wrists with the same brand of white athletic tape. And when he killed, it was with bullets to the back of the head. Many robbery victims had caught a glimpse of him, but Lisa Garcia was the only one who had seen him kill. He was described as a white male in his 20s with dark, bushy hair. He wore an adhesive bandage on his nose, probably to distract his victims from noting his features. But police still didn't know who he was. He had committed more than 20 acts of rape and robbery and was already suspected of killing 5 women. Julie Reitz made it 6. Like the office building Garcia was shot in, Reitz's house was along the I-5 corridor. Garcia gave the I-5 killer a face. Reitz gave him a possible name, Randall Woodfield. The blood and hair samples gathered from Woodfield's apartment, bolstered by the paper trail of his phone bill, gave authorities enough evidence to go to Woodfield's home and arrest him for suspicion of murder as the I-5 killer. But to build their case, they needed as much evidence as they could muster. Lisa Garcia, the sole survivor of the I-5 killer's murderous attacks, was called in to identify him.
Either in the yes or the no column, if it's not the mayor, on this sheet that I've given.
Do what I say and you won't get hurt. Don't call the police. Where's the back room?
Thank you.
A lineup was arranged. Participants were asked to recite statements made by the I-5 killer.
Stand up to the microphone, please.
The circumstantial evidence against Randall Woodfield was strong. His physical description and movements matched the killer's profile. His housemate confirmed that he was out of the house on the nights the killer struck. The hairs from Woodfield's bedroom matched the strands found in Julie Reitz's bed and in the office building where Lisa Garcia was attacked. He had type B blood.
Do what I say and you won't get hurt. Don't call the police.
All the police needed was a credible eyewitness.
Do what I say and you won't get hurt.
Lisa Garcia unequivocally picked Woodfield from the lineup. It was the voice, she said, that clinched it. If the bullet found in his apartment could be linked to the .32 caliber slug removed from Lisa Garcia's skull, the case against Woodfield would be a lock. But police faced 2 problems. The single bullet found in his possession hadn't been fired, so it bore no marks that would enable police to compare it with a bullet from any crime scene. And worse, they had no gun to test fire it with. Traditional ballistics testing would be useless. Instead, investigators needed to compare the bullets atom by atom. At Oregon State University's Radiation Center, analyst Michael Conradi uses nuclear power to put criminals behind bars.
They called us up and described the evidence that they had and asked us if we could help them with that. We told them that that was an ideal situation and for activation analysis.
Conradi received 4 bullet fragments from crimes police suspected were the work of the I-5 killer. He was also given the bullet found in Woodfield's gym bag. His job was to see if they matched. Manufacturers produced bullets in batches. Each tank of lead contains different amounts of the trace elements silver, copper, tin, antimony, and arsenic. A process called neutron activation analysis allows scientists to compare minute levels of these elements. This enables them to identify bullets produced in the same batch. Conradi cuts a sample from the bullet, flattens it into a wafer, and cleans it in nitric acid to remove contaminants. A pneumatic tube sends it on its 16-foot underwater journey to the core of a nuclear reactor. At the core, the sample is bombarded with subatomic particles called neutrons. Some of the atoms in the sample absorb some of these neutrons. The sample becomes unstable, releasing the extra neutrons in a burst of energy, in a process known as radioactive decay. Every element releases this radiation in its own unique and consistent pattern. By reading the pattern, the element and its quantity can be identified. Once the container is shuttled back to the lab, Conradi has to hurry before the radioactivity diminishes. Otherwise, he'll have nothing to analyze.
I have a minute to get this sample out, decapsulated, and on the detector.
He places the disc on a computerized sensor. The system produces a pattern showing the relative amounts of each trace element in his sample. If the unfired shot from Randall Woodfield's apartment matched the slug removed from Garcia, the suspect wouldn't be able to dodge a conviction.
Gary, you got the IR for the Woodfield.
The samples yielded an identical pattern. Neutron activation analysis proved that the bullet fragments from the crime scene and the bullet from Woodfield's apartment came from the same batch. The bullet from his apartment matched the one taken from Lisa Garcia. Fiber, hair, and telephone records tied him to several other crime scenes. Woodfield was a sly, methodical killer who prepared for his attacks with a ritualistic intensity. His pattern was as consistent as it was deadly. His formula for targeting random victims made him seem unstoppable. But then he broke his routine and turned on someone he knew. That ultimately led to his capture. Based on the evidence, investigators assembled the final hours of Julie Reed's.
Mr. Woodfield would come to her house at approximately 3 in the morning, contact her. He had been drinking.
Hey, Julie.
Hi.
How you doing?
Asked if he could crash there for a while.
Just thought I'd come by to see you.
Yeah.
She apparently agreed. They had a couple glasses of wine. She put on some coffee.
It's been okay because that's really all I have.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Because I think that's all I have. You're right there somewhere. Just give me one.
At that time, he pulled the gun, took her upstairs,
No, what are you doing? What is?
raped her, sodomized her, and then coming down the stairs, shot her twice in the back of the head.
Armed with an imposing forensics case, the prosecution was able to prove that Randall Woodfield was the I-5 killer. He was found guilty of murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of sodomy. He is currently serving life plus 165 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. A killer's motivations often lie beyond the scope of forensic investigators. Detectives must satisfy themselves with learning how, when, and by whom a murder was committed. On the afternoon of April 3rd, 1985, a bridge club convened at the Boonesboro, Virginia home of Derek and Nancy Haysom. Though both their cars were in the driveway, neither 72-year-old Derek nor his wife answered the door. Fearing trouble, the guests called a family friend who came over with a spare key. They were alarmed. Derek never missed their weekly game, certainly not when he was hosting. Inside, investigators from the Bedford County Sheriff's Department were faced with a gruesome scene.
Anybody call a coroner yet?
They determined that Derek and Nancy Haysom had been killed the previous weekend. Their throats were slashed, their bodies marred by numerous wounds. Detectives eliminated robbery as a motive for the killing. There was no forced entry, no valuables or money taken. The floors were smeared with blood. Investigators wondered whether the odd patterns pointed to occult killing. Forensics expert Steve Rush was one of the first on the scene.
The entire floor had been wiped in blood. All this kind of took me back because it was so unusual that somebody would, at that time I thought, play in the blood.
As investigators scoured the scene for evidence, they realized that the cryptic swirls were actually the work of a murderer trying to cover his tracks. They feared he may have succeeded all too well. Normally, a messy crime scene yields many clues, but the scene at the Haysom house in Virginia wasn't the aftermath of a sloppy killer. When the criminal noticed that he was leaving footprints, he removed his shoes and camouflaged the tracks. A single print survived. The oak flooring on which it appeared was sent to the lab for analysis. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science, Dr. Robert Hallett uses footprints to stop criminals in their tracks. He works from life-size photos to keep the original prints free from damage. From telltale weave patterns, he could see that the print from the Haysom house came from a foot in a sock. A bare foot would have made his job easier, because feet, like hands, bear tiny grooves called friction ridges. A print expert relies on these ridges to precisely match a footprint to a person.
They can make a positive identification to the exclusion of anyone else. They could say that that print was made by the person who gave them a known impression. That's not possible in this examination.
Hallett would have to base his analysis simply on the foot's anatomy. Though the photograph from the Haysom house indicated that the foot had been dragged, Hallett was pleased with the evidence.
The impression is complete. I have a heel, I have an arch, I have a metatarsal pad or ball of the foot, and I have 5 toes that are distinctly shown. And that is considered to be an excellent photograph to work with.
But until Hallett had something to compare it against, the bloody sock print would be useless. He would have to wait for a suspect to surface. Despite the lack of hard evidence, lead investigator Lieutenant Ricky Gardner was already forming an impression of the assailant.
It was obvious from the get-go that whoever performed or committed the murders was very angry with both Mr. and Ms. Haysom.
The Haysoms appeared to have known their assailant and had even shared a meal. Stale remnants of food and wine lingered at 2 place settings, but 3 chairs, not 2, appeared to have been pushed back abruptly from the table. The Haysoms were killed by someone they didn't fear, but should have. Gardner's team searched for any small clue they could find, any hint of the killer. They tried to elicit latent fingerprints by sealing the house and pumping it full of superglue fumes. Hours passed as they laboriously analyzed a house full of fingerprints. But out of the thousands lifted from every surface, no suspicious ones could be found. The killer left no fingerprints. Now investigators were out for blood, hoping to track the killer's movements by the bloody trail he left. To reveal subtle traces, the forensics team used luminol. The chemical combines with blood, even drops imperceptible to the human eye. When the light goes out, the luminol-enhanced blood glows under an alternate light source and filter.
The luminol indicated to us one person coming out of the house, going down to the driveway, and appearing to get into an automobile. These were photographed and swabs were taken and was identified as blood.
The victim's blood, tracked on the killer's socks, revealed only one set of prints. It confirmed a lone assassin. A more intense search continued inside to see what else the blood might reveal. Once again, they pored over every inch of the house, looking for telltale clues of the killer's movements. Through most of the house, the luminol told investigators nothing they didn't already know. Then, in the bathroom, the chemical revealed one single drop separated from the rest. The killer failed to completely wash it away. Detectives supposed it came from the killer's own wound. Testing showed that the droplet was type O. It could not have come from Derek, who was type A, nor Nancy, who was type AB. If the killer had bled elsewhere in the house, his blood would have been mixed with the victim's and been rendered unidentifiable. The careful killer had left a vague trail, but no hints about the motive. Investigators questioned friends and family, asking each where they'd been on the weekend of the murder and checking every story. No suspect surfaced. They hoped that the Haysom's daughter, Elizabeth, could provide information, since she had only recently left home. A freshman at the University of Virginia, she was an extremely bright young woman, educated in Swiss and English boarding schools. She described the Haysoms as warm and loving parents. She couldn't imagine who would want them dead. Elizabeth said that she and her boyfriend had been in Washington, D.C. when the murders occurred. She was able to provide movie stubs from the weekend. In checking her alibi, Gardner obtained their hotel and car rental receipts. The documents raised more questions than they answered. The car rental receipt showed they'd driven 669 miles, but the round trip from Charlottesville to D.C. is only 240 miles.
When I went to Charlottesville to talk to Elizabeth, I confronted her with the fact that we had learned of this, and she stated that they had done a lot of traveling and had gotten lost on several occasions. And I'd say, you have to get major lost to have that many miles on a car.
It was inconceivable that they racked up an additional 429 miles in 2 days of city driving, unless a trip to Boonesboro was added to the equation. Gardner contacted Elizabeth's boyfriend to hear his side. Jens Soring, a German citizen and son of a diplomat, shared Elizabeth's intellect and international background. The Jefferson scholar hardly seemed the violent type. Like Elizabeth, he said they had put the extra miles on the car when they got lost while sightseeing. Suspicions peaked when Jens refused to supply a blood sample or foot impression, claiming his involvement might endanger his father's diplomatic status. Police arranged a second interview with Jens. He never showed. Instead, Elizabeth's half-brother found a note in Elizabeth's apartment. In the note, Jens explained that he and Elizabeth, weary of the investigation, had left town. He asserted his innocence, claiming that he was not a violent person. A search was conducted. Jens and Elizabeth could not be found.
Well, since you've read, you already know. They're not coming back here.
Several days later, Jens's car was located 340 miles away at Newark Airport. Detectives believed that the couple had fled to Europe. With their international backgrounds, Elizabeth and Jens would have no trouble covering their tracks abroad. Interpol was notified, but had no recourse. No charges had been filed, no evidence against them had been gathered. The investigation came to a screeching halt. All police could hope for was that one day soon, the couple would slip up and resurface. Seven months passed. The prime suspects had fled to Europe. Then, in May 1986, a British detective searched the flat of a young couple who'd been arrested for check scamming. Browsing through a box of their love letters, he realized that they were guilty of more than fraud. The lovers had planned a murder. The letters and diary told a far different story than either Jens or Elizabeth had shared with police back in Virginia. Elizabeth had loathed her parents and their smothering involvement in her life. She particularly resented their intent to separate her from Jens. She wanted them dead. Would it be possible to hypnotize my parents, she wrote, do voodoo on them, will them to death? Why won't my parents just lie down and die? I despise them so much. Jens wrote that he was willing to help concoct a scheme to pull it off. A constable from Scotland Yard contacted Detective Gardner.
And he says, I understand you may be interested in Jens Soring or Elizabeth Haysom. And I'm going, yeah. All the time, you know, I'm sliding up in the chair a little bit more. And he says, were her parents murdered?
Gardner caught the next plane to England to confront Jens and Elizabeth with their own words. Elizabeth, struck with remorse, admitted she knew about the murders beforehand, but didn't commit them.
I think that was... I'd never seen it.
She returned to Virginia for trial. Jens admitted killing the Haysoms, but as a German citizen, he hoped to get his case moved to Germany, where he would be tried as a minor. If found guilty there, he'd do only a few years' time. Then he could be reunited with Elizabeth.
He advised me that he was ready to tell me the truth, and he just started with when they met in the fall of, he and Elizabeth met in the fall of '84. They fell in love, and one thing led to another.
Jens told Gardner that he was so in love with Elizabeth, he'd do anything for her, even kill.
I mean, he was smitten, obviously, by Elizabeth. I mean, this was probably, if not the one of the first relationship that he had ever had. And I mean, she had manipulated him into feeling that, you know, you're my future, and we'll spend the rest of our lives together, and you're my only love. And he, you know, he went for it. He fell for it.
But back in Virginia, Elizabeth turned on her lover. She portrayed Jens as a bloodthirsty psychotic who killed without much urging. She'd lived in a state of terror afterwards, she said, fearing that Jens would kill her if she went to the police. On August 24, 1987, Elizabeth pleaded guilty to being an accessory before the fact. She thought she'd get off easy, but she was sentenced to 90 years in prison. Jens fought extradition for 3 years. Then the United Kingdom agreed to extradite him when Virginia promised it would not seek the death penalty if he were found guilty. When it was clear Jens was to face hard time in the States, he changed his story, pinning the murders on Elizabeth. He claimed that the roles of killer and accessory were reversed. Elizabeth had killed her parents while he stayed in Washington. He'd lied about it until now to protect her. Jens was a good storyteller, but forensics would provide the definitive account. The next step in the Haysom murder investigation took place in the lab, where Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Soring made footprints.
And now I want you to walk through. Be sure all parts are touching. All right, stop. All right, now just walk right on through.
Robert Hallett compared these impressions with the print gathered at the crime scene. Transparencies were made of the prints. Hallett drew parallel lines through each image to compare them. A distinguishing feature appeared on the photograph of the bloody print. The ball of the killer's foot formed a plateau between the second and third toes. Following the line, Hallett found a striking similarity with Soring's footprint.
It exactly touched those same two positions on the impression of Jens Soring. However, when that parallel line, keeping it equidistant all the way across, came to this position for Elizabeth Haysom, the pad, metatarsal pad, was significantly below, quite a bit below.
Elizabeth's print didn't have this feature and was eliminated. Hallett tested Jens's print further.
This is the impression that we're trying to determine as to who made, and I've placed an overlay over it, the right foot of Jens Soring, placement of the toes, metatarsal pad, the ball of the foot, the arch, and the heel all exactly match. There were no differences.
In Hallett's opinion, Jens Soring had left the print.
The foot that made that impression was either that foot by Jens Soring or someone that had a foot exactly like his, and I've never seen such a condition to exist.
Next, a sample of Soring's blood was tested against the single droplet found on the floor of the Haysom's bathroom. They matched. Both were type O. Soring couldn't get around the evidence in the case. A single sock print and one wayward drop of blood indisputably put him in the house on the night of the murder. His own letters spoke of premeditation.
I'll get it.
At trial, an account of the murder was pieced together. Jens and Elizabeth had met in school, but the Haysoms didn't think Jens was good enough for their daughter. They had been threatening to use their influence to have Jens expelled from the university.
Come on.
Determined to stay together, Jens said, he and Elizabeth made a plan. While she created an alibi in Washington, Jens drove to Boonesboro to kill her parents. They invited him in. He made a final plea to keep dating their daughter. Derek Haysom refused. He swore he'd do everything in his power to keep them apart. That's when Jens lost control. He pulled the knife he'd purchased that day and killed the Haysoms. For his crimes, Jens Soring was found guilty of first-degree murder and given 2 life sentences. Forensic science can't explain a killer's lethal obsessions, but detectives and the scientists they rely on are driven by obsessions of their own. In the field or in the lab, they are on a mission to stop killers, no matter how long it takes. Police find a frozen body in the Arizona desert. The chilling discovery sends investigators searching for more victims. A small town, a brutal murder, and a killer who could be anywhere. When all leads are exhausted, the investigation focuses on a blurry surveillance photo. When a young mother disappears, detectives are left with few clues. But slowly, the evidence begins to point to a dangerous and twisted predator. A lack of clues may cool down a hot investigation, but there's no statute of limitations on murder. Months or even years may pass before forensics can spark a fire under these cold cases. On June 3, 1991, investigators from the Costa Mesa, California Police Department pulled up to an abandoned car on the Corona del Mar freeway. They were responding to a call regarding a missing person, Denise Huber, age 23. No one had seen or heard from her for almost 24 hours, and that wasn't like her. Denise's best friend had found her car on the side of the road while searching for her. Investigators examined it closely, but aside from a flat tire, nothing seemed amiss. The only personal article they found was a pair of pantyhose on the front seat. Denise preferred to drive without them. Though nothing in the car tipped investigators about what had happened, Detective Ron Smith concluded that Denise ran into trouble soon after she had pulled off the road.
What struck us as unusual about the scene and concerned us right from the very beginning was that very near to her car there were emergency call boxes, there were pay phones, there were all-night convenience stores, none of which Denise went to call her parents or to ask for help. We knew right away that something was amiss, something was wrong.
The last person who saw Denise was her date from the night before. She had dropped him off after a concert. Denise never made it home. Bright, popular, just graduated from college, she wasn't the type to worry her parents by going off without a call or note. Her family and friends started to look for her the next morning. After recovering her car, the Costa Mesa police launched a massive search for Denise Huber. They notified law enforcement agencies across the country. They followed up every clue, every lead. Denise's friends and family put up posters and appeared on news programs begging for information. As the months and years passed, the tips dried up. But police kept Denise's case open and as active as they could.
Every day we would do something with the Denise Huber case. We would review old leads, we'd go over old reports again. We'd look one more time at the photographs. We never gave up, even though we never really had anything good to work with.
After 3 years, no one could tell her grieving family and friends what had happened to her. Denise Huber had simply vanished. Meanwhile, more than 300 miles away in Arizona's Prescott Valley, authorities were grappling with a mystery of their own. On July 9th, 1994, a woman went to buy paint at the home of a man she met at a swap meet. While she waited for him, she noticed a padlocked rental truck and the paint and chemical cans cluttering his yard. She thought they looked out of place for such a respectable neighborhood and wondered if any laws were being broken. Suspicious, she called a friend who worked for the police. Her friend thought it sounded like a clandestine drug lab, which police find in the most unlikely spots. He sent investigators from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department to check it out. The rental truck with the California tags looked like it hadn't been moved in months. The electrical cord snaking out of it and the paint cans all around reinforced the notion that this might be a mobile drug lab. A check of the tag showed the truck had been stolen. Armed with a warrant, police cautiously opened the cargo door. Inside was a freezer.
Ready, guys? We're opening up.
Not knowing what it might contain, they suited up in protective gear. Plastic bags obscured the contents, but at the bottom of the freezer lay a pool of frozen blood. Carefully moving the bags aside, the officers expected to find nothing more than a deer. Instead, Lieutenant Scott Masher uncovered a horrific mystery.
Initially, when we opened the black bags and could tell that we had a human, a frozen body with handcuffs behind the back, ice crystals. It was grim.
The homeowner still hadn't returned, so police ran the license plates on the white pickup, also parked in the driveway. The owner was identified as John Joseph Famolaro. Within an hour, Famolaro and his mother pulled up to the house. Sheriff's deputies took Famolaro into custody, charging him with stealing the rental truck. They were anxious to find out more about the body in the freezer. Mrs. Famolaro, who lived next door, told detectives that her son was a house painter, which explained the paint cans. She said the truck had been parked there about 2 months. She didn't know anything about the freezer or its contents, except that the electricity in John's house had been turned off for 1 day, and he had asked to run a power cord from her house to the truck. At the police station, Famolaro was polite but uncooperative. He refused to answer any questions and asked to see his lawyer. Without any assistance from their suspect, investigators would have to rely on physical evidence at the scene to identify the body in the freezer and to find out how it got there. They charged Famolaro with homicide. The next day, warrant in hand, investigators entered Famolaro's house, hoping to find information about the victim in the freezer. In its frozen condition, they couldn't even discern the victim's gender.
Look through these things on the chair.
Famolaro's house was crammed with his belongings. This was the home of a man who never threw anything away. If clues were here, they'd be difficult to find. After more than 2 weeks of searching, investigators found several promising clues. The first was a set of handcuff keys that matched the cuffs on the victim.
Bag it and tag it. Okay.
The next clue took investigators by surprise. 2 complete Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department uniforms. In the garage, the deputies found 2 boxes marked Christmas, but there was nothing merry about them. Inside, officers found blood-stained women's clothing and a bloody hammer and nail puller. They also found a pair of women's shoes, the backs badly scuffed, as though the woman who wore them was dragged.
Get a couple of bags here. A shot of this hammer.
And that wasn't all.
We did locate numerous female identifications. That included Social Security cards, I believe some driver's license, and other identification, obviously raising the concern of maybe we had additional victims.
Yavapai County Police had to face the very real possibility that John Famolaro was a serial killer. Arizona investigators looking into a murder had every reason to believe that there may be more than one victim. To test that theory, investigators brought in cadaver dogs to locate more bodies on John Famolaro's property. The dogs, trained to detect the slightest whiff of decay, alerted their handlers several times. Officers dug up every spot and still found nothing. But they never completely gave up the suspicion that the killer had struck before.
I just got that paperwork from Costa Mesa
Police followed up on every piece of ID found in the Christmas boxes. Much to their relief, they found that each woman was alive and accounted for, except one from Costa Mesa, California. Her name was Denise Huber. To confirm her ID, Yavapai County forensic technician Mike Winnie lifted a thumbprint from the thawing victim and compared it with the one printed on Denise Huber's California driver's license. The prints matched, identifying Huber as the victim. To authorities in Arizona, the name meant nothing. But to Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, it was the news he had waited 3 anxious years to hear.
The call I received from Lieutenant Scott Masher from Yavapai County was that he thought maybe he had a body identified as Denise Huber and asked us if we were familiar with Denise Huber. Well, of course, I almost fell out of my chair when he mentioned the name.
Now that she had been found, investigators in Arizona had to determine how she had been killed. Working with the frozen and decomposed remains presented a unique set of challenges to Maricopa County Medical Examiner Ann Buchholz.
In our environment, to examine a frozen body is very unusual. We deal 99% of the time with people who have been exposed to heat elements, and that is more our area of expertise than someone who has been in a cold environment. It took the body approximately 2 days to thaw where we could actually perform the internal examination.
On Friday, July 16, 1994, Yavapai detective Scott Masher and Costa Mesa detective Ron Smith, along with other officers, gathered in the medical examiner's lab to observe the autopsy. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in multiple fractures. To identify the murder weapon, investigators needed to evaluate the entire skull to see where and how the blows had been struck. They called in forensic anthropologist Laura Fulginitti.
How many days are we looking at here?
Reconstructing a person's skull is very similar to doing a jigsaw puzzle. Essentially, you have about 50 pieces and you need to put them back into what you know to be the right composition.
It took Fulginitti 2 days to reconstruct the skull, never losing sight of the fact that this victim was once a person.
And I remember standing in this very room thinking to myself, how did you come to be in my sphere? This is not right. It's not natural for you to be here.
She determined that the victim had sustained more than 35 blows to the head. The wounds were consistent with the hammer and nail puller pulled from the box in Familaro's garage. To be certain, the lab ran tests. Technicians were able to establish a DNA profile from the blood residue on the nail puller. It matched the DNA profile taken of the victim's own blood. The match confirmed that they had found the murder weapon. To build their case, investigators had to retrace the events that led from the victim's abandoned car on a California freeway to John Familaro's freezer in Arizona.
Covered initially as far as the search warrants at this point.
It was very important for both agencies, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office and the Costa Mesa Police Department, to work together and piece the evidence from California and Arizona to one case, one solid case, in order to successfully prosecute this.
The Costa Mesa Police Department gathered information on Familaro's activities during the time he lived in California. They learned that he had attended the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Reserve Academy, but he couldn't make the grade and dropped out after just a few weeks. He kept his uniforms, which police found at his house. Further investigation led detectives to a warehouse in Laguna Hills, 12 miles from where Denise Huber's empty car was found. John Familaro had stored some paint and supplies in the warehouse, then moved everything out when he left the area in August 1992, 13 months after Denise Huber vanished. Investigators thought it was likely that Familaro had committed the murder here. They hoped to recover forensic evidence that would tie the killer to the crime and determine where the killer's trial would take place. Police searched the unit for evidence of the crime, using luminol to expose traces of blood. Applied to a surface and viewed under an alternate light source, luminol reveals blood stains invisible to the naked eye, even traces left years earlier.
We found that the warehouse was huge. but I wanted every square inch luminol for blood. Almost the very last bottle in the very last corner that we looked, we sprayed luminol into the corner against the wall. And all of a sudden, the luminol just lit up. This bright glow showed us we found what we were looking for.
Technicians compared this blood to a sample taken from the victim in Arizona. They matched. The forensic analysis gave Detective Smith of the Costa Mesa Police the proof he needed to make the case.
The forensic science in testing the blood was absolutely critical. Number one, it established that the crime occurred in California, and that established jurisdiction. It also positively identified that blood as Denise. It put Denise at that scene.
Famularo never confessed. The forensic evidence spoke for him. The investigators had successfully matched the blood in the California storage unit to the victim in Arizona. And that placed the victim within deadly proximity of John Famularo. Authorities believe that Huber pulled off the road with a flat tire. Spotting his prey, John Famularo approached under the guise of lending a helping hand. He abducted Denise Huber in Costa Mesa, California, in the early morning of June 3, 1991. Famularo murdered her sometime later, hid her body in a freezer, trucked it to Arizona, and kept it until police discovered his crime 3 years later. John Famularo was sentenced to death. He awaits execution on California's death row. Famularo hid his crime by keeping the body close to him. Other killers are not so conniving, but they can be equally elusive. It was a December evening in 1990. Peggy Phillips wondered why her husband Dean was taking so long to lock up the laundrette they owned in Ozona, Texas. It was just next door, but he'd been gone 20 minutes.
Dean?
She found him lying on the floor, bleeding and barely conscious. Police and paramedics raced to save him. Peggy thought that Dean must have fallen and hit his head. But the paramedics could see that this was no accident. Dean Phillips had been beaten nearly to death. Peggy watched as the paramedics loaded her husband into the ambulance. It was the last time she saw him alive. Dean Phillips died early the next morning, December 26th. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators determined that Phillips had interrupted a burglary and paid dearly for it. They found only one hard clue, a single fingerprint lifted from a coin box left on the floor. They sent the print to the Texas Department of Public Safety. Like small-town police departments all over Texas, the Ozona police depended on the DPS crime lab for forensic services. This time, though, the Department of Public Safety came up empty. The coin box fingerprint didn't match anything they had on file. News of Dean Phillips's death spread through Ozona. Crockett County Chief Deputy Sheriff Alton Davis was determined to catch the criminal who had shattered the quiet of this little town.
We've got a population of probably 3,000 to 4,000 people, so it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody, and it was a real shock to the community that something like this could happen in Ozona.
The community stepped forward to help the investigation. A witness reported seeing two local men wearing bloody clothes the night Phillips was killed. A warrant was obtained, and their bloody clothes were confiscated before they had time to launder them. Brought in for questioning, the men claimed they were hunters and that the blood was from a deer they had poached.
Last night we had a very serious
Investigators were
situation.
skeptical until they got confirmation from the DPS crime lab.
Let's get to the question. What time did you
The
get
blood
the call?
was indeed from a deer,
10:30.
and the men's fingerprints didn't match the one lifted from the coin box at Phillips's laundry. The case's first promising tip amounted to nothing. A clerk at a convenience store right off the interstate gave investigators their next lead.
You got a couple minutes I can talk to you?
Yes.
A man came in an hour before the murder and asked where the launderette was.
And we're just checking the neighborhood.
She described him as stocky, with dirty blonde hair and a t-shirt with radio call letters.
Oh, what time was that?
He drove a beat-up blue van with a green door on the passenger side.
Then he walked.
There may have been a passenger in the van.
And then
Investigators hope to see the suspect on the store's surveillance tape.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Okay. Listen, you have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
But the security camera was old. The man's face was a blur. Neither the DPS nor the FBI could enhance the image electronically. The investigators were convinced they had their suspect on this tape, but his image, like their chances of finding him, were dim.
How you doing today?
As the investigation into the murder of Dean Phillips continued, witnesses reported seeing a strange blue van in town the night of the murder. Some thought they saw two people in it. Sheriff Alton Davis believed that Phillips's killer was a stranger just passing through town.
Ozona is right on Interstate 10, or more or less out in the middle of nowhere. This is the first one we've had where someone has came off the interstate and murdered one of our local people.
Investigators knew the killer was probably hundreds of miles away by now. And then they got the call. A van, matching the one described by the witnesses, was stopped about 200 miles west of town. Davis sped to the scene.
We found an old GMC van, light blue, that had a dark passenger door on it, dark primer colored. And we took photographs of the van. We talked to there was a Hispanic male driving it, which didn't fit the description of our suspect.
The case had run into another dead end. Reviewing the clues they'd gathered so far, investigators realized that all they had to go on was a blurry surveillance tape and a store clerk's fading recollection.
Fingerprint at DPS.
They needed some way to turn these hazy clues into solid information. Then they recalled Karen Taylor, an experienced forensic artist with the Special Crimes Service of the Texas DPS. Taylor had worked with the Ozona police on missing persons cases. She is a pioneer in the forensic art and science of facial reconstruction, developing witnesses' vague descriptions into recognizable faces of criminal suspects.
My function is to take some bit of information from a crime that occurs, produce some sort of a visual image that can be put out in the media, and hopefully it will trigger additional information that can be used to connect the crime to the victim or connect the crime to the suspect.
Ozona police sent Taylor stills taken from the videotape. But after she had evaluated the black and white photos, she wasn't sure she'd be able to help.
So I had a look at those stills to see just what I could determine about the face. It was very blurry, the quality was pretty poor. So I could see that There wasn't much likelihood we could enhance that video electronically, and it would probably boil down to my trying to just do some sort of a sketch based on what I could see.
Taylor knew that while every feature might not be rendered perfectly, the sketch's resemblance to the suspect would be strong enough to help the investigation.
Well, after years of doing this, I've come to believe that the most important thing to capture in a face for a forensic artist to trigger recognition is getting the proportions right. Each of the component parts in a face, each of the features, the eyes, nose, mouth, is important, but it's not as important as the arrangement of those features on a face.
Taylor wasn't sure the image had enough information for her to work from. Then she noticed a feature she'd overlooked: the store clerk. She had talked with the suspect face to face. Taylor hoped the clerk might provide the missing details she needed to sharpen the picture.
Using the video stills, I prepared as much of a drawing as I could, maybe 85% done, and then faxed it to the witness. Got on the phone with her, and she was able to make some changes. She said she wanted me to make the eyes look light, make the lower face look more slim, and I did that. We hung up. I spent about 15 minutes making those alterations, and then I refaxed it to her, and she checked it and said, yes, that's right. So I was able to get the benefit of her long-distance input over the phone and using the fax.
Here he was, the most likely suspect in the murder of Dean Phillips. The Crockett County Sheriff's Office prepared a crime bulletin. Karen Taylor's drawing of the suspect's face was circulated across the country and to every radio station where someone might recognize the call letters on the suspect's shirt. Taylor's drawing represented the investigation's last hope. But when all the publicity brought no response, the Dean Phillips murder case came to a dead halt. The beating death of Dean Phillips looked like it was destined to go unsolved. Sheriff Alton Davis and his team had exhausted their last leads.
Eventually, we'd ruled everybody out we were getting, and the leads stopped coming in, and we didn't have anything to work on, and it just more or less went cold, and we just had to sit until we got some other type of leads.
5 years came and went without another clue or lead. But Peggy Phillips was determined to bring her husband's murderer to justice. She contacted a television crime show and asked if they'd run her story. In August 1996, just over 5.5 years after Phillips was killed, the TV show aired the story of his murder and featured Karen Taylor's drawing. That's what got the phones ringing. From around the country, viewers called in leads. Texas Ranger Jerry Byrne fielded the calls and directed the investigation. One tip led him to Paul Wesley Taylor, a convict at Utah's minimum security prison in Draper. Ranger Byrne contacted Draper Prison and asked for Taylor's records and a photograph. When he saw it, Byrne felt that at last they had tracked down their suspect.
The photograph of Paul Wesley Taylor was nearly identical to a composite drawing that a DPS artist had conducted back in 1991. Initially, I felt like it was too good to be true.
Byrne sent Taylor's records and fingerprint card to the DPS. They matched Taylor's right ring finger with the coin box fingerprint. After years without progress, this was a giant step forward. Investigators went back to the original set of clues, looking for more connections to the suspect. They found out that Taylor's brother worked at a radio station with the call letters seen on Taylor's shirt. They were now certain Paul Wesley Taylor was involved with the murder of Dean Phillips. But they wanted to know about the van's passenger, a witness, or possibly an accomplice to Phillips's murder. Taylor's arrest record showed that his girlfriend had been with him at the time of his arrest in Georgia. Georgia authorities located the woman. Her answers filled the remaining gaps in the case against Taylor. She told Ranger Byrne that they had traveled through Texas during December 1990 and that Taylor had pulled up outside of a laundrette and gone in. She saw him fighting, and he returned to the van with blood on his shirt. And she certainly didn't know that anyone had been killed.
He never said that he killed her?
She led investigators to a field where Taylor had ditched his bloody clothes, along with a stolen coin box. They now had a credible witness who placed Taylor in the laundrette at the time of the murder. Utah extradited Paul Wesley Taylor back to Texas. On September 15, 1998, nearly 8 years after the killing, he pled guilty to the capital murder of Dean Phillips. On the 21st, he was sentenced to life in prison. Forensic artist Karen Taylor had turned a single blurry photograph into an image that helped unmask and apprehend a bald-faced killer.
When that photograph and drawing were presented, they knew that it was Paul Wesley Taylor. That photograph and that composite drawing is what broke this case open.
Investigators speculate that Paul Wesley Taylor got off the interstate in Ozona to get some food and gas. Short of money, Taylor got the idea to knock over the laundrette after closing time. Dean Phillips was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In other cases, tragedy stalks its victims. August 16, 1989, Joe Gilbreth finished work and arrived at his home in Villanau, Georgia. He was looking forward to spending the evening with his baby girl, Amber, and his wife, Nikia. He noticed that his wife's car was gone. This was odd. Nikia was usually home fixing supper at this hour. When he went inside, he started to worry. Nikia would never let Amber sit in her pajamas all day, and there was no way she'd ever leave the baby in the house by herself. The doors were unlocked and didn't look like they had been tampered with. When Nikia's family told Joe they hadn't heard from her, he called the police.
Nikia!
The Walker County Sheriff's Department sent officers to investigate.
Check the residence and you don't see her, and you're on the
Joe and his mother-in-law reported 3 missing items: a blue telephone cord that had been ripped from the wall, a bedspread that had a sheet stitched to one side, and all of Nikia's underwear. Based on what he found in the house, Detective Pat Bedford believed that Nikia Gilbreth's disappearance was more sinister than the simple missing persons case he was originally sent to investigate.
My first impressions are, she was taken out of here bound. Somebody forcibly was taking her from this residence. When you tie that into the fact that it was realized that a whole drawer full of her undergarments and lingerie was missing, it makes you think that we're dealing with one of the serious crime here.
Checked around, see if there's anything missing by chance.
Took a shower.
Joe Gilbreth told the police that the day had started like any other.
I checked all the house and I could.
The alarm went off at 5:30. Joe got up and got ready for work. Nikia went back to bed. And by 6 a.m., the house was quiet. Joe and the baby were the last to have seen Nikia. A squad car was stationed at the house in case she might return. but Nikia never came home. On August 18, 1989, the day after she had disappeared, the Walker County Sheriff's Department had little to go on.
We got a tragedy here. We got a problem. At first, no good leads to follow up on. Her car had not been located. She had not been located. Didn't appear to have any leads from talking to neighbors and searching the immediate area. We had nothing at that point.
But that soon changed when Nikia's mother found her daughter's car abandoned on a logging road a half-mile north of the Gilbreth house. Investigators hoped they'd find clues to help locate her. Technicians raised fingerprints all over the car, but they belonged to members of the Gilbreth family. Officers found indications of a second car parked next to Nikia's. It was an ominous sign, but the tire impression wasn't distinct enough to photograph or print. Nikia's mother noted that the baby quilt Nikia always kept in the back seat was missing. And that was it. Nothing at the scene offered a clue of what had happened to Nikia or where she might be now. Still, her family held out hope that she'd come back to them unharmed. Though investigators believed she was a victim of foul play, they had no evidence and no suspects. Joe had passed a polygraph indicating that he wasn't involved. All they had were a few missing items and an abandoned car, but still no sign of Nikia. Two days later, a boy collecting empty cans along the highway made a crucial, gruesome discovery. The body was too decomposed for a positive visual ID, though it was a white female about Nikia's size, with the clothes and jewelry Joe had described. Dental records confirmed everyone's worst fears. The autopsy determined that Nikia had died from asphyxiation. The examination also revealed marks around her wrists and ankles, marks that could have been made with telephone cord. But there was no other significant forensic evidence. No hairs or fibers, no fingerprints on the body. Nothing that might dictate the investigation's next step. Investigators considered a number of suspects, but none of them panned out. Leads dried up. The case went cold.
Unfortunately, we were going nowhere in the case. We had no good leads, no good suspects. Any tips that we got, we did everything from roadblocks, car to car, house to house, door to door searches, searched the area thoroughly. We weren't able to really locate anything that was helping us. Several months went by and we really weren't making any progress in solving this case. You cannot let something like this go on. You've got to be able to solve this case.
Then, 4 months after Nikia Gilbreth disappeared, investigators heard about a similar case in nearby Gordon County. A young woman was abducted by an intruder while her child slept. For 14 hours, he forced her to model lingerie for him and assaulted her repeatedly. Then, he brought her back home. Before police could identify the woman's assailant, the case took a bizarre turn. The investigation into the death of Nikia Gilbreth had led to a similar account of a woman's abduction. The connection was weak, but it was their only lead. 2 days after the assault, the woman's father reported to police that he saw a strange man drop off a Christmas tree at her house. When investigators ran the truck's license plate, they discovered that it was registered to James Ray Ward. He worked for a nearby well drilling company. The woman picked out Ward's picture from a photo lineup. She recalled that during the day she was being held, she told her assailant that she hadn't had a chance to get her child a Christmas tree. Officers took Ward into custody a short time later. Ward pled guilty to rape and was just starting a 20-year prison term. In their check into his whereabouts prior to his arrest, police learned that Ward had drilled a well at the Gilbreths a year earlier. Then he returned to check on it in July 1989, just a month before Nakia was killed. Ward's employer said that drillers were never sent back to check on wells. Ward had acted on his own. The similarities between the abduction of his rape victim and the abduction of Nakia Gilbreth provided police with their only lead. When officers searched the home Ward shared with his wife and children, they found a stash of women's undergarments that didn't belong to Ward's wife. Detectives also uncovered a receipt for well drilling made out to the Gilbreths. But it was much more than a receipt.
Had directions, the road name, the mileage that would have led me right to the Gilbreth residence. The description of the victim he had written in there matched her description, including an age of a daughter that the victim had. Then we had our first direct link from the murder to a suspect.
Investigators also found items missing from the Gilbreths' home. A bathing suit bottom, a baby quilt, a bedspread, and a blue telephone cord.
Got it. Phone cord.
In order to build the strongest case against Ward, investigators needed to prove premeditation. They obtained a statement Ward had written regarding the abduction he'd pled guilty to. They wanted to compare this writing sample with the incriminating notes jotted on the Gilbreth's receipt found in his home. Document examiner Karen Scott performed the analysis.
A handwriting comparison is basically a side-by-side comparison. I look for features in the writing of one set and I see if I find the same thing in the other set. And I'm looking for things like how the letters are on the piece of paper, how they're formed, how they're spaced.
Scott looks for the idiosyncrasies, the little details that give a person's handwriting its individual character.
For instance, the F in the word fine, it's very short, the very bottom of it. The D in the word road and side are written opposite the way people are taught. Staff first and then the round part. While this is not in and of itself a unique just to this writer, it is not the way it was taught to be done.
After comparing the note with Ward's known handwriting, Scott was confident that both documents were written by the same person. Investigators then examined the bedspread, quilt, and bathing suit bottom found in Ward's house. Nakia's mother supplied the matching top, which she found in the Gilbreths' home. Because hundreds of identical bathing suits were manufactured and sold, the prosecution had to prove that the bottom found at Ward's and the top found at the Gilbreths were parts of the same suit. To make that assessment, the lab had to compare the amount of fiber wear on both parts of the suit. They concluded that the bottom matched the top. The suit belonged to Nakia Gilbreth. The investigation turned to the other two items, the bedspread and the baby quilt. Before she even put them under a microscope, trace evidence technician Terry Santamaria recognized their significance.
I knew that these types of bedspreads did not come commercially from the manufacturer with a sheet sewn to it, so I knew that the item had been altered by somebody. After determining that, I then examined the baby quilt. When I pulled the baby quilt out, I immediately recognized that this was homemade.
Santa Maria called Detective Bedford. These two items, the bedspread and the blanket, were absolutely unique, one-of-a-kind items. They were a direct link from the suspect's home back to the victim. This evidence completed the case against James Ray Ward. At Ward's trial, Nikia's mother-in-law testified that she had stitched the sheet onto the bedspread to cover the rough cloth and had sewn the baby quilt for her granddaughter. The only way that they could have come into Ward's possession was if he had gone into the Gilbreth home and Nikia's car and taken them. Ward never confessed, but based on the evidence, investigators pieced together a scenario for the murder. On the morning of August 17th, Ward watched Joe Gilbreth leave for work. When he saw it was safe, he entered the Gilbreth home and abducted Nikia.
I believe he pulled the telephone wires and the cord away from the wall. I believe he bound her, wrapped her in the quilt, and on the way out the door also took a drawer full of her underwear and lingerie as a trophy.
Prosecutors called Ward a meticulous, organized stalker with a perverted mind. Investigators speculated that he fantasized that the women he was assaulting liked him. That might explain why he returned to place a Christmas tree at the door of one of his victims' homes. Jurors convicted him of murder, and in July 1991, after deliberating just 3 hours, he was sentenced to death for murdering Nikia Gilbreth. When the leads disappear and an investigation stalls, that doesn't mean a case is closed. In a homicide, investigators have an arsenal of forensic techniques and all the time in the world to catch the killer.